Welcome, everyone, to our fourth virtual presentation and the first presentation in the 2021 York Sunbury Historical Society Speaker Series. Let's begin the program. I am going to ask Stephanie Pettigrew, member of the Board of Directors of the York Sunbury Historical Society, to introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Melinda. It is my very great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Richard Yeomans. Richard is a PhD candidate at the University of New Brunswick in the Department of History and is current president of the History Graduate Student Society at UNB. His dissertation, which is supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, explores the development of science in pre-Confederation Atlantic Canada, but focuses in particular on the pursuit and uses of science in the province of New Brunswick to protect and regulate natural resources. Richard's other research, there's a lot of other research, examines the legacies of loyalist constitutional thought during and after the American Revolution, the history of smuggling in the Bay of Fundy, that's my personal favorite, the agriculture and industrial exhibitions, and how the maritime colonies protected the Atlantic fishery against encroaching American fishermen, and the threat of overfishing after the British-American Convention of 1818. Currently, Richard is co-editor of the New Brunswick Storytellers book project with me, an edited volume of short essays and microhistories on New Brunswick's pre-Confederation past. He's also working with the Atlantic Canada Studies Center at UNB, also with me, on the development of a documentary of environmental change in the lower Bay of Fundy and on Grand Manan. This connects the island's past with current efforts to protect marine life in the North Atlantic. I see there's a lot of our cohort from UNB in the audience. So just to clarify, Richard does go by Murray quite often. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Richard, and I look forward to his presentation. Richard.
Well, great. Thank you, Stephanie, so much for that, and for putting up with me with all the various things that we work together on. There is a lot. And I also want to thank everyone who took the time out of their day to tune in and listen to my presentation about early science in New Brunswick. This is a topic that I have always found incredibly fascinating, not just the history of science in this region, but also the history of science throughout the larger British Empire. Part of what I hope to communicate in this talk is that science in New Brunswick really was connected within a much larger web of imperial science throughout the British world. So for this region, I think that the history of science offers so much when it comes to the study of places like New Brunswick. Early scientists and their endeavors tell us a great deal about the kind of societies that they thought possible, how it could be invented, and the lessons through trial and error that often shaped the unique idiosyncrasies of the different parts of the British Empire before 1900. A lot of histories of science that focus on other parts of the British Empire have emphasized that settlers arrived with a preconceived idea of colonial space, and that even when they were confronted with the material reality of new environments, it was these preconceptions of immigrants that continued to shape their behaviors and assumptions. Even when faced with new and unfamiliar surroundings, the response of individual settlers, colonial administrators, and the scientific fraternity was conditioned by the nature of the places that immigrants had come from, by their socioeconomic experience, and even what was in scientific fashion of the day. Science, as we think of it today, is really rooted in the development of the colonial world. One of the best examples I can think of is that of Francis Bacon, who was the father of empiricism and the scientific method, as well as one of England's leading natural philosophers in the 17th century. And Bacon firmly believed that human beings were destined to recover their right over nature, and grounded that argument within a biblical tradition particularly from the book of Genesis. But what's interesting to me is how Bacon and others like him interpreted that dominion over nature as an empire. And that idea in turn shaped colonial developments from the Virginia Company to Newfoundland. So much so, in fact, that Bacon was one of the associates who supported John Guy's attempt to establish a colony in Newfoundland in 1610. So the idea of science and scientific modernity really was a great motivator when it came to European imperialism in North America. And as much as other Atlantic colonies, early science in New Brunswick was very much cast in a cauldron of British influence. Though the scientists that I'm going to talk more about in a little bit always kept an eye to the United States and sometimes continental Europe, I'm going to do my best to try and keep things a bit more local. When I was first approached by the organizers for this speaker series, I was asked to give a lecture on a central New Brunswick topic. And I just published a short essay on the Bride and Jack Observatory at UNB, which I will speak to more in a bit. But the problem of trying to talk about science in central New Brunswick is simply that early scientists in New Brunswick and their research was never stationary, especially by the 19th century. The kind of work being done in this region almost always involved working in the field, going out, collecting specimens, and using the senses to better understand the world and the landscape. This is particularly true of the scientists who were born elsewhere, and only later in their lives did they arrive in New Brunswick, where their knowledge of the physical aspects of the world, like geography, geology, or botany, didn't necessarily translate easily from one place to the next. And this is, I think, especially true in New Brunswick, which is home to such a diverse and really often volatile environment. And as mobile as these scientists were, they were themselves connected, corresponding, and sometimes even depending on researchers working in other provinces, in different states, and even on different continents. New Brunswick is not historically thought of as one of the great centers of scientific research. This is especially true if you compare it to places like Oxford, Paris, or Berlin. But what's important to note is that the scientists, the educators, and the inventors of New Brunswick all fit within that same global scientific network. And their methods derive from similar schools of thought, similar sources, and even similar texts on a particular topic. With that said, one of the key questions I'm going to try to explore here is what exactly was motivating science in New Brunswick before Canadian Confederation in 1867? And the answer is much the same as any place. It's the environment. Environmental challenges to life inland and at sea, be it means of transportation, communication, agriculture, and commerce more generally, are excellent and persistent motivators. As the old saying goes, necessity is the mother of all invention. And in New Brunswick, necessity often took shape around navigating the St. John River, making sure farms could consistently produce food, not crashing your ship into Partridge Island when fog covers St. John Harbor. And for those from New Brunswick, they know that that's just about every day. And when it's not foggy, how do you locate the border? That imaginary line drawn by European powers that became a huge issue for New Brunswick immediately after it was separated from peninsular Nova Scotia. These are big questions, but they all center on the power behind being able to scientifically validate the ownership of land and sea resources, and resources that belonged and continue to belong to Indigenous peoples. And this was a huge part of how Europeans disrupted First Nations, often despite treaties in this region. Settler science is always science in the service of empire. And I emphasize that point because some Canadian historians have argued that because Canada never had what could be considered a formal empire, then therefore science in what would become Canada was always peripheral to developments elsewhere. And that's a bold claim, not just to say that Canada never had an empire, but one that I think also ignores the role of science in the development of every colony that would confederate in and after 1867. Science doesn't always have to involve a laboratory, experimentation, and funding from a government. Often, it's just about finding ways to rationalize the really difficult parts of the human experience, to understand difference between plants, animals, people, and sometimes that difference is interpreted as a kind of justification for how plants, animals, and people are treated. And we see this with a lot of Enlightenment thinkers. So it really is useful to position science in the broadest sense, as opposed to a narrow one. Now, a really fun question to ask students at any level is, if you were going to teach a course on, let's say, the history of New Brunswick, where would you start? If their answer was the arrival of Loyalist refugees in 1783, I would probably raise a few red flags. And I think the same would be said if the course was on the history of science in New Brunswick. A lot can be said about how Acadians shaped their agricultural practices to the salt marshes, the development of the aboiteau, which was the hinged valve within the dikes around the Bay of Fundy. But even starting there would imply that the scientific method is a uniquely Western idea, and it's not. The word science is almost frustratingly anomalous, but at its core, science is about relationships. Astronomy and cartography are about the relationship between the cosmos and the Earth. Botany and zoology are about the relationship between plants and animals. The key here is that these relationships are defined through whose eyes they're seen. And for Indigenous peoples, they have a unique way of seeing their relationship to the physical world. With that said, I think I can more easily say that the Loyalists were not the first naturalists in this region, not by any stretch. But when they arrived, the Loyalists brought a particular set of needs that was very much frustrated by New Brunswick's environment. And this, I think, really highlights just how little the British actually knew about the interior of Nova Scotia that was supposed to become its own colony in 1784. And this map that I've included here is just a fantastic visual for this. It was produced in 1778 by Joseph Frederick Wallet de Bars, who was a cartographer during the 7 Years' War, and who later would actually become the Lieutenant Governor of Prince Edward Island. And from the map, you can see that peninsular Nova Scotia is remarkably accurate. It's complete with topographical data even. But if you go above the Isthmus of Chignecto, the outline of New Brunswick is pretty good, but as you can see, the interior is almost completely bare. The St. John River and its tributaries are mapped to about Grand Falls, and there's actually even an excellent letter in the archives from the Governor Thomas Carleton to Lord Sidney, who was the British Secretary for War in the Colonies. And the governor is very excited to announce that they've decided to move the government upriver to Fredericton, and he calls it to be the metropolis of New Brunswick. But in the same letter, he actually complains that no one in the British sphere had bothered to map above Grand Falls. So it's just this really interesting tension. Also of note in this map is that the St. Croix River is non-existent. And I find this really ironic when you think about just how much focus that little stretch of water is going to pull in only a matter of decades. I also don't want to give the impression that the Loyalists were oblivious to the fact that Britain had a lack of knowledge. and the obvious problems that could arise from a lack of knowledge about the interior of New Brunswick. There was just very little that they could actually do to correct the situation. And in many cases, things like land surveying in the province, especially in and around the Passamaquoddy Bay, depended on Passamaquoddy and Penobscot peoples. By 1800, famed Loyalist legislator Edward Winslow even complained that it was a lack of scientific data about longitude, which caused most of the problems that New Brunswick's House of Assembly had to contend with in its first 15 years. Loyalist legislators did, however, respond by enacting extensive series of acts and pieces of legislation to help manage natural resources and key parts of the province's food economy. New Brunswick passed more regulations to the fishery than any other British colony before 1867. And when they were crafting these policies, they often consulted scientific research of fish, and in particular on Atlantic salmon. And just as an aside, there's some great work being done by Dr. Elizabeth Mankey, who also happens to be my academic supervisor, asking how common resources were regulated in the Atlantic region and how early environmental science was often a major component to that. So if not the Loyalists, who were New Brunswick's early scientists? Well, they were most often Scottish immigrants. They were men born in the United Kingdom, trained at British universities, and they inherited their method of thinking from the likes of Francis Bacon and John Locke. There were, of course, homegrown naturalists like Moses Pearly and Nova Scotia's Abraham Gesner. But I would argue that science in 19th century New Brunswick was really defined by Scottish-born thinkers who believed that the best way to understand the world around them was to actually go out and explore it. And that knowledge came only primarily from sensory experience. So from things that you can see and that you can touch, and then from those objects, the information that you can discern from them. And with that said, there is no person who better embodies Scottish empirical-based science in New Brunswick than James Robb. Robb was born in Stirling, Scotland in 1815 to a fairly upper middle class family. His father was also a doctor, and his mother was a very active member of the community, the church, and both parents supported Robb and his academic pursuits. There's unfortunately not a great deal known about Robb's formative years in Scotland, but we do know that he graduated from the University of Edinburgh in 1835 with a medical degree. There's no evidence that he ever took up a practice in Scotland or anywhere else, but his interest in chemistry and natural science are well documented and were developed enough that he joined an established German naturalist, Otto van Beneden, on his own expedition through southern and central Europe in 1835 to collect specimens. The two traveled to Milan, Genoa, Nice, and even the Mediterranean island of Sardinia, which garnered Robb quite a bit of favorable attention at the University of Edinburgh. And when King's College Fredericton was seeking a qualified individual to teach chemistry and natural science in New Brunswick, Robb was recommended by his teachers to go to Fredericton. And thankfully for me, he accepted. And Robb arrived at St. John in the late summer of 1837. And this was a very turbulent time in Canadian history, mostly because of the looming rebellions in the other colonies, but also because St. John Harbor, or St. John, had just experienced a rather large fire that destroyed approximately 30 buildings and portions of the harbor front. And in a lot of ways, I think the scene that Robb encountered at the docks of St. John was a metaphor for how he saw society in New Brunswick as being sort of under construction. Robb wrote in great detail about his early days in New Brunswick, who he met, what he imagined his life was going to be like in the colony, and even his observations on the outbreak of rebellion along the St. Lawrence River. In one memorable letter to his mother, Rob describes the officers of the militia as they were getting ready to march to Quebec to help quell the insurrection as looking more like, and I quote, bears than civil, well-bred Englishmen. And he had a very unique way of describing Fredericton in 1837. And he even concocted a kind of recipe to describe the town when he wrote that if you were to take the building style of Derby, England, and add a Yankee with a quill in his ear, then there you have the average North American store. So true to form, Rob, like any scientist, understood New Brunswickers through varying degrees of difference and similarity. And the observations he made and reported to his family back home were almost analytical to a fault. But it also goes to show just how observant Rob was. And his correspondence really provides some fantastic, almost literary-like detail of life in 19th century New Brunswick. And one of the frustrations that Rob expressed early on was the difficulty of trying to teach natural science, like botany and geology, to New Brunswick's youth when he himself had only just arrived there. So if you're coming from Scotland and you're just seeing New Brunswick for the first time, how are you supposed to explain the flora and fauna of New Brunswick when you yourself haven't actually seen it? Well, the solution to his problem was to actually go out and explore it. And explore it he did. Following the closure of King's College for the summer the next year. After only being in New Brunswick for a year, Rob set out on an impressive trek throughout much of the province and even through parts of central Nova Scotia. Leaving Fredericton at the end of June and accompanied by a hired servant who I suspect was a student at the college, Rob set out for Woodstock on his way up the St. John River on the 30th of June, 1838. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately for me anyway, Rob's expedition did not start well. Being unfamiliar with the terrain, he initially set out by foot from Fredericton on the south side of the St. John River. And after an entire day, he stalled when he encountered a very large gorge after having walked, by his own estimation, about 30 or 40 miles upriver. And what he found was actually the Big Pokiok Falls, which, before the construction of the Mactaquac Dam in 1967, had flowed over a large ledge into the St. John River from a gorge that cut extensively into the riverbank. And there are a few really great photographs of the Pokiok Gorge from the early 1900s that give a sense of what Rob ran into. So from the one I included here, you can see kind of just the height of the gorge. And at the very top, there is a small little man-made bridge. There were other ones built at a later date. From his correspondence, I'm going to guess that Rob did not run into a section that had a small bridge. And although the first of many obstacles, it did not temper his spirit. As he wrote, and I quote, the falls, though small, were well worth seeing and amply rewarded me for the trouble of reaching them. And running into the falls, I think, also proved to be an invaluable lesson for the young Scot on how to navigate through New Brunswick. River travel by 1838 was still dominated by small watercraft, especially above Fredericton, since the first steamers primarily moved between the capital and St. John. And realizing that walking to Woodstock was not a feasible plan, even though his goal was to become better acquainted with the landscape, Rob turned to the indigenous peoples of the river valley, the Wolastoqiyik. And at Pokiok, he hired a guide with a canoe to continue upriver. And this began, I think, a critical stage in the history of science in New Brunswick. Though Rob was not the first scientist to rely on New Brunswick's indigenous peoples for transportation, Rob's is the first expedition of this scale in the Maritimes for the purpose of collecting specimens of New Brunswick's diverse plant life and minerals. And the success of Rob's expedition to become more familiar with the province's landscape allowed him to become a central part of numerous other endeavors in the province over the next 2 decades. From his 1838 expedition and others in subsequent years, Rob collected over 400 natural specimens and amassed just a wealth of knowledge about the interior that would later be used by New Brunswick's first Museum of Natural Science, which is still housed by UNB, to improve the region's agricultural practices and produced informed literature about New Brunswick, which was used to bring future immigrants into the province. Scientific innovation in New Brunswick, though, is most often identified or at least associated with Abraham Gesner, the Nova Scotia geologist who invented kerosene in 1846 using New Brunswick albertite. But what a lot of people don't know is that James Robb's work in the field often fed Gesner's published papers about New Brunswick geology. And the two actually often disagreed about the agricultural possibilities in the province. Gesner sometimes likened New Brunswick's soil to be something like another Eden for the purpose of promoting the province, while Rob, who had actually worked in the field, was really hardly convinced. And this, I think, goes to show just how critical Indigenous peoples were and continue to be when it comes to understanding the natural landscape. For Rob, it was certainly much more apparent just how critical Indigenous peoples were to expand his research. And over the course of 6 weeks, Rob continued up the St. John River during the summer of 1838. He met with Wolastoq chiefs at Tobic, portaged the Grand Falls, and even remarked there that those falls were, and I quote, "very much better than any of the Swiss waterfalls, which are so much vaunted." At Madawaska, Rob parted with his Wolastoqiyik guides, and he hired 2 French settlers to take him up the Grand and Restigouche River to Dalhousie. And this was probably the most difficult part of his journey. Rob described the Grand River as, I quote, "shallow, narrow, winding like a serpent or 50,000 serpents, infested by mosquitoes, black flies, and sandflies, so numerous that the moon could scarcely rise through the heart of them." And when they made camp along the gravelly riverbed, which I think Rob more aptly described as a ditch, the expedition would use spruce boughs as beds, hunted birds. They made sure to pour enough whiskey into their water so that they could actually sleep. And in a letter to his mother, Rob wrote at length of this part of the journey, describing how the group would, and again I quote, "anoint our hands and face with mosquito pastes, put on our gloves and veils and try to sleep. The sun and the flies, called by the Indians, bite him no see hims, were the greatest pests, but at length the sea breeze of the Bay of Chaleur brought a cure for both, and worn out and fatigued, we arrived at Dalhousie, a thriving Scotch settlement at the mouth of the Restigouche." And they stayed only a short while before Rob again hired Indigenous guides, most likely Mi'kmaq this time, to take him back south, first to Bathurst and then to Chatham along the Miramichi River, where Rob remarked upon the devastation of the forests. In 1825, most of northern New Brunswick was burnt by a wildfire. And to describe this scene, Rob wrote that one must, and I quote, "conceive half of Scotland to be covered with aged pine timber. Conceive this tract peopled in part, filled with animals of all kinds, and conceive it all to be burnt to the ground in 20 to 30 hours. And you will have an idea of this, perhaps the most frightful on record of any of the dispensations of Providence." And from Chatham, they would continue down the coast, portaged crisscross over the Isthmus of Chignecto, and then further south to Halifax, and then north again to Windsor, where Rob visited Nova Scotia's King's College and was altogether unimpressed by the school. He even went so far as to suggest that scholarships offered by King's College Windsor were more like bribes if you considered the education that it offered. So he was pretty damning. And from Windsor, Rob moved through the valley and on to Kentville, Annapolis Royal, and at last across the Bay of Fundy, and finally arriving at St. John by mid-August, with an impressive collection of plant and rock specimens that would become the backbone of his museum at King's College in Fredericton. And this small museum, as I mentioned earlier, exists still as the Connell Memorial Herbarium located at the University of New Brunswick. Rob's collection of plant and rock specimens also became part of collections at the New Brunswick Museum and became part of the development of natural science at an institutional level in New Brunswick. Rob would continue to lecture on the subject for many years. He worked with farmers to improve their conditions and modernize the practice of agriculture throughout New Brunswick by establishing the New Brunswick Society for the Encouragement of Agriculture, which was actually an early predecessor to the Provincial Department of Agriculture after Confederation. And by 1840, his efforts increased, and Rob worked to establish a chemistry laboratory at the college. And began to build a modern library with texts that he imported from Europe and the United States. Unfortunately, this was a difficult process. King's College was, for a time in the 1840s, in danger of closing when a portion of the assembly wanted to divert monies from the college's provincial grant to other institutions. And Rob's own money would even be lost when a ship that was carrying supplies to furnish his chemistry lab and books for the library was wrecked on Sable Island. So again, it just kind of goes to show how the environment keeps throwing a wrench into science's plans in New Brunswick. But thankfully, Rob was not alone in his efforts through the 1840s, and this again didn't temper his spirits. The 1840s, though, was a turbulent time in New Brunswick's history and was marked by significant social change and at times even unrest. The Aroostook Wars, which was a struggle to secure timber rights, culminated in the 1842 Webster-Ashburton Treaty between Britain and the United States to locate and define the New Brunswick-Maine border. The province also experienced a great deal of political unrest and debate following a mutiny on Grand Manan over the use of glebe lands, and there was a great deal of infighting between New Brunswick's House of Assembly, the British Parliament, and Washington, D.C. over who had access to the Atlantic fishery. And these were all developments that were occurring simultaneously with the expansion of steam-powered travel in New Brunswick. And at the same time, there was the arrival of New Brunswick's probably, I would say, New Brunswick's most famous scientist, William Bryden Jack. And when Jack arrived in New Brunswick, he was expected to teach courses on mathematics and physics, but quickly he realized the need for more practical scientific knowledge and how that could benefit the colonial government in New Brunswick, especially considering all the issues they were facing both externally and internally. By 1840, there was still no accurate map of the province, and no doubt he saw that it was a want of data about longitude and latitude that was leading to so many problems when it came to questions like the border. Having recently graduated from St. Andrews in Scotland, Dr. Jack was uniquely qualified to tackle the province's challenges, and his passion for astronomy would lead to many firsts within the province. But it was his friendship with Dr. James Robb that would help him to garner support from both the college, the assembly, and later the lieutenant governor to build the first astronomical observatory in British North America. Plans for an observatory in New Brunswick had been in the works for many years before it actually came to fruition, even before Jack arrived. Observatories played an important part in building a transcontinental British Empire and produced knowledge that helped pave the way for the commercial exploitation of Indigenous lands, rivers, and territories in New Brunswick. How an observatory could be used to study, map, and understand land and water was central to much of the correspondence written by Jack, his colleague, Dr. Robb, and others. An observatory in New Brunswick was not just a tool meant for scientists to observe the stars and discern from them information about the world below. In fact, by mid-century, the academic study of the cosmos became an important buttress for commercial enterprise on land and at sea. In one 1845 petition to the House of Assembly of New Brunswick, James Agnew, who was a St. John watchmaker, boasted of the great advantages that would result to the commerce of that place by the erection of an observatory and praying legislative aid towards accomplishing so desirable an object. Agnew's petition was tabled, but it was given serious attention by the Legislative Assembly when they commissioned the province's naval surveyor, William Fitzwilliam Owen, to investigate the potential for an observatory at St. John. And Owen, much like Jack and Rob, believed that the necessity of an observatory in New Brunswick was evident. Owen pointed out that an observatory would improve obtaining true time by the sun, and doing so, it would regulate the marine chronometers or the timepieces of the numerous merchant ships that traversed New Brunswick's ports en route to New England, Britain, and the small islands of the Caribbean that really required precise longitudes, and precise longitudes, of course, require precise timekeeping. Arguments for building an observatory in New Brunswick were often shaped by ideas derived from a discourse of the public good. And for Owen, such a building was comparable even to the construction of lighthouses. Owen would go so far as to suggest that monies for the Seamen's Hospital Fund or the Lighthouse Fund could be used to front the cost of building an observatory, which he estimated at only being £450. But despite Agnew's petition and Owen's report, the St. John Observatory was never built. But the attempt to build it, I think, amplified a conversation about the utility of science and astronomy in New Brunswick, particularly as it related to the border. Writing in March of 1847, James Robb discussed with New Brunswick's Lieutenant Governor, William Coolbrook, of Bride and Jack's plans for a magnetic and meteorological observatory at Fredericton. The construction of an observatory in New Brunswick was becoming intricately linked to broader geopolitical questions. And though the Webster-Ashburton Treaty would settle the borderline in 1842, issues still arose over questions of jurisdiction and property ownership in New Brunswick, particularly around the St. Croix River. The Honorable Judge Carter, wrote Robb, and his dilemma of an abundance of cases brought before him wherein disputes of the boundary line arising from want of this data was not alleviated by the 1842 treaty. There was still no accurate map of New Brunswick, and the situation was not going to improve itself without an observatory to rescue New Brunswickers from, and again I quote, falling deeper into this bottomless pit of litigation. Jack and Rob continued to press the issue of an observatory. And fortunately, a great deal of their correspondence is maintained in the minutes of the New Brunswick Executive Council, showing that they successfully lobbied the College Council to buy them the equipment needed for astronomical observation. The most expensive of this equipment was a 7.5 foot long brass and mahogany telescope that was custom made in Germany, and cost more than £500. So it was more than William Owen estimated for an entire observatory only a few years prior. The telescope would arrive in May of 1849, at which point Dr. Jack set out to persuade the council and the legislature that a proper observatory was needed to house it, which, interestingly enough, Jack actually designed himself. And construction began on the King's College Observatory and was completed by 1851. And from here, using telegraphic communication, Jack was able to compare his sightings from Fredericton with the Harvard Observatory and calculate using a chronometer, or again a timepiece, in conjunction with his astronomical readings, an accurate position of Fredericton in relation to Boston. With this, Jack could know by degrees of longitude that Fredericton was exactly 4 hours, 36 minutes, and 33.34 seconds west of the Greenwich Observatory in the United Kingdom. And this was the first accurate measurement ever made in Canada by 1855. So the mid-century, it brought about many exciting new firsts in New Brunswick and innovations that have gone on to shape life in the Atlantic region. I've already mentioned that kerosene, I've already mentioned the invention of kerosene from Albertite out of Albert County, New Brunswick. But this province is also where the first steam-powered river transportation system in Canada began in 1816, and is also home to some of the earliest chartered companies by a provincial government for the purpose of promoting steam transportation. And closer to home, Fredericton and St. John were the first two cities in New Brunswick to begin using gas-powered streetlights and lights in homes. The Fredericton and St. John gas light companies were chartered in 1847 and 1848. And over the course of 3 years, built a system of underground pipes that would help illuminate the urban cores of the cities. In Fredericton, there was actually a great deal of excitement about the use of gas-powered lights along Queen Street, which is the city's main commercial center. Again, writing to his family in Scotland, this time in November of 1850, James Robb described the modernization of Fredericton with much relief and welcomed the development as a sign of the colony's maturing. He even quipped that he would toast with whiskey and electricity the turning on of the lights in New Brunswick's capital. The celebration was, again, unfortunately, short-lived. After only 3 days, the gas-powered lights would backfire and, according to Robb, set a blaze that consumed about 130 houses from a fire that lasted only 3 hours. Writing after the event, Robb remarked that, and I quote, "Wooden towns have to be burnt someday. It is all an affair of the wind, and one day they will return to the ash." But from then on, Fredericton would use brick, which is now an iconic part of the cityscape here, and a reminder of what happens when innovation goes haywire. And just as an interesting aside, Fredericton City Crest was also designed by James Robb. When the town was incorporated, Robb acted as a councillor for Kingsward for many years, and I would say his legacy is perhaps the most recognizable symbol in the city, although very few in the community actually know who he is. Even his gravestone in the old burial ground downtown has been worn down to the point where you can't even find it without a bit of searching. I included a photo of it here, and at the top you can actually see that someone has engraved a specimen of a thistle in a way that it would have been preserved by Robb. So I think it's interesting, that symbolism as a part of his legacy. So to finish, scientific exploits in this province really began as more of a flicker. But by the time of Robb's death in 1861, it was fever pitch. And sometimes, as was the case in Fredericton, it was an outright blaze. Writing in his biographical sketch of Robb in 1898, Loring Wirt Bailey, who succeeded Robb in teaching natural science and chemistry at UNB, described how Robb was living in a constant atmosphere of science. And he was. Robb's remarkable career and work in botany and agriculture helped him to travel throughout much of the Northeast, as far west as modern-day Hamilton, Ontario, and even on to New York and Washington, D.C. But his work and career success would not have been possible without the help of New Brunswick's Indigenous guides. Otherwise, he may never have gotten past the Pokiok Gorge. So finally, I really want to end by again pointing out that early science in New Brunswick, like so many parts of settler society here, depended on Indigenous peoples. Transportation into the interior, through the woods, using the rivers, and even navigating the tides of the Bay of Fundy were all challenges that Indigenous peoples in this region have spent millennia developing solutions to. And these solutions were essential to every settler population that arrived here, from the Acadians to the planters, the Loyalists, and then later waves of British immigrants like Rob and Jack. Sometimes survival depended upon Indigenous knowledge of food. The fiddlehead is a great example, but for the scientists that I talked about here, they were necessary guides. Even Bright and Jack depended on Indigenous peoples when he trekked up the St. John River to locate the longitudes for Woodstock, Grand Falls, and other communities along the river. Indigenous people were so important to scientific research in New Brunswick before Confederation, but they figure very little in the scholarship of it. They are barely present in most of what's written on Jack, Gesner, and Rob, and others. So it's my hope that this talk and really my future research continues to shed light on that just absolutely critical relationship. So thank you for taking the time to listen. And I will now pass things back to Melinda for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, also known as Murray, to his friends. And that was absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank Stephanie Pettigrew for her introduction of our speaker tonight. I'll start with the very first one, which was a comment by Don Stevenson. And he asked, the comment was, science was well developed before the arrival of the British colonists, the Loyalists. And he said, for example, the botanical research by French colonists Cheque, I believe, and early Jesuits were assisted by the First Nations people. And I think you've addressed a little bit of that, but I don't know about the French colonists, so if you had talked about that, or do you know much about that?
Yeah, I do know a little bit of it. For me, my main focus is on Anglo settlement in what the region we now call New Brunswick. And again, the point that I made in my talk is that though the Loyalists are, not the first naturalists by any stretch, you are right, Don. It's the set of needs that they bring that really changes what it is that scientific inquiry is doing in this province. So for people like the Jesuits, it's finding, useful herbs for medicinal purposes and building relationships with Indigenous peoples, versus for the Loyalists and later Anglo settlers, a lot of it has to do with validating their ownership of land, which is land that, taken from the Acadians, then the planters, but first belonged to Indigenous peoples. So, but thank you, that's an excellent comment.
Okay, we have another question from Evelyn Fiddler. She'd like to know, would Moses Pearly's field work be considered scientific?
Absolutely. When I wrote the description for this talk, I had intended to include him, and he's even in the promotional photos. So yeah, Moses Pearly is actually a great example of a homegrown naturalist. And Pearly, by about the same time that Jack and Rob are working on building an observatory, Pearly is the commissioner for Indian Affairs in the province. And he issues a number of reports on the status of Indigenous people, and sort of how they're living, their food ways. The really interesting thing about Pearly is he's thought to be very sympathetic to Indigenous peoples in this province. I think it's C.A. Murray wrote the entry on him in the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. Pearly has a very strange relationship with Indigenous peoples here. When he was a young man, he shot an Indigenous person point blank. And even though he would write these reports on the status of Indigenous peoples, I already mentioned that New Brunswick is really actively trying to protect the fishery. In one of Pearly's reports, he point blank says that we should protect the fishery unless it's being used by indigenous peoples, at which point we should encourage its destruction so that the indigenous peoples will also be destroyed. So Pearly is a great example of, yeah, you're totally right, Evelyn. Yeah, bang on.
Okay, here's another question. Is it fair to say that New Brunswick has more of an engineering approach and less of a science base?
I don't know if it's fair. I mean, the development of engineering comes relatively late to New Brunswick. I don't think a formal program has started here until the very end of Jack's tenure. Even after that, I'm trying to remember, there's an article written by Richard Jarrell in Acadiensis about science education in New Brunswick. So I think it's a fairly late 19th century development, at which point New Brunswick already has things like, you know, a couple of natural history museums. It's leading the way with geological exploration and trying to attract capital development, which, yeah, like that does have an engineering component, certainly by the end of it. So I guess it kind of depends on which scientist you're asking, Brad. I think Rob and Jack would probably say more of the latter, and people like Gesner might say more of the other.
Okay, here's another question from Hal Scarab. Is the original telescope with the observatory now, or was it replaced?
That's a great question. I asked that myself. So the observatory is currently managed by the physics department at UNB, and I was hoping to get inside and take a few photos of it. Unfortunately, it's currently not open to the public, not because of COVID reasons, but because it doesn't have a floor. They're in the process of renovating the building. The telescope, I'm pretty sure, was replaced later on. There's some great photographs that are housed by UNB's special archives and special collections of the telescope being used in the 80s before the observatory was more or less became more decorative. So I'm fairly certain it was replaced, but I'm not 100% sure.
It sounded like it would have been a good object to have in the museum here, but I was thinking if it was up there, that would make a more interesting attraction to go visit.
Yeah, well, Bryden, so I included the image of it in my presentation, but Bryden Jack's personal telescope is actually held by the Fredericton Museum. They were kind enough to let me go in and view it. It's about this big, and it's just solid brass. Unfortunately, the eyepiece is gone out of it, so it's just the container, but it's still really neat to see.
Evan McTavish asks, compared to the inland start of his 1838 travels, was the latter portion of Rob's expedition along the east coast of New Brunswick intentional, and or did he ever further explore into central New Brunswick?
Yeah, no, it was. Rob initially set out thinking that he would kind of trace the province along the rivers. So in his letters, he outlines to his mother his plan that he would like to make it up to Dalhousie because he knows it is a Scotch settlement, and he thinks he's going to know people there. So he had always intended to more or less trace out the province and get a general sense of it. Rob would continue to do a number of other expeditions through New Brunswick. He did one from Fredericton heading north up to they were then the beginning of Scotch settlements in the interior around the village of Stanley. So, which is why you see so many places called like Scotch Lake and Scotch Town and Scotch Settlement in New Brunswick, which would then later be abandoned because you can't really farm there. And then he would come out through the Miramichi River again to Chatham. But yeah, he did, I think at least 6 expeditions. I'm not 100% sure on the number, but he did quite a few.
Okay, there's another question from Jackson. Your presentation shows our perception of Indigenous peoples as pre-scientific is wildly wrong. Was this belief shared at the time by British colonial society, or did it develop later?
It was shared by British colonial society. So unfortunately, I didn't mention in this talk, but scientists like Rob they're very much trained in the traditions of the Scottish Enlightenment and the idea of the stages theory, so that human evolution moves in stages of development from hunter-gatherers to agrarian to, I think the next one's pre-civilization, then. So anyway, you get the general picture. So Rob, yeah, absolutely interpreted his interactions with Indigenous peoples that way. It's not something that developed later on. It's you can draw the connections right through to how we treat Indigenous peoples today sometimes. I actually pulled the title of my PhD dissertation, which is Inventing a Bountiful Earth, from a poem that Rob wrote about his encounters with an Indigenous chief. And he's just very racist. He accuses Indigenous peoples of being idle and the like, right? So this is how these scientists understand difference, is they kind of tear it apart and they rank things into different taxonomies.
The last question via chat is from Don Stevenson again. And I don't know if you know the answer to this question, Richard, but he says he's curious about the course of the Grand River. And does it still extend from the St. John River to the North Shore? And if so, from where to where?
That is a great question. So the map that I included, Stephanie was kind enough to do that for me, because I am horrible with ArcGIS software. And so when we were trying to map the Grand River, it is like, Rob was not kidding when he said it is like 50,000 serpents, and it's very narrow, and there's very little mention of it. So the Grand River does start in and around just above the Grand Falls. I would say it is not the same river, like physically, it's not the same river that Rob was on. Even Rob mentioned the effects of the timber trade on it. He says that, there's portions where he has to get on an axe to try and get through the logs in what's left of the river. And so when we were trying to find it using current mapping software, I think that's a great example of how 19th century and 20th century the timber industry actually probably destroyed the river. So yeah, it does eventually connect to the Restigouche about maybe, 150 kilometers down from the head of the Bay of Chaleur, but it is hard to find.
Murray, you might not know that I have an obsession with old maps. I'm sure that's a big surprise to you.
I'm shocked.
Shocked, I know. So my question is about the map that you showed early on in the presentation with the sort of the gap for interior New Brunswick. Can you remind me what the date was for that?
1778.
Okay. So my question is, what do you know about sort of the gaps in knowledge between map makers and cartographers at that time? So sort of the gaps in knowledge and science, I suppose, because there were maps of interior New Brunswick that were created right after the deportation. It was part of the surveys that were done by Morris. Yep. It was right up to St. John River, right up to the St. Lawrence River Valley. So to have that big of a gap is kind of shocking to me.
Yeah. One of the, and I love this book. So Max Edling did a book on a new map of empire, Britain's ideas of America before the revolution or after it, or in and around that kind of time period. And he makes this really great observation that local cartographers were producing these excellent maps like Morris that had great detail. And often they were looking at sources produced by folks like the Acadians or other French settlers in and around the Mississippi River Delta when they were trying to map like the interior of the continent. Whitehall, unfortunately, has a successive string of just choosing to ignore these perfectly fine maps, and the St. John River is a very good example of that. So they commissioned DeBar to do, I'm trying to remember the name of the book, but it's this massive collection of American maps called Atlantic Nautica, or I can't remember the exact title of it, but kind of to recommission these maps. And a lot of them are very flawed. And one of the best examples I can give was the mouth of the Mississippi River.
I was just about to say, Elizabeth is in the chat, and I bet she remembers the name of the book.
Atlantic Neptune, yes. But one of the best examples I can give is the mouth of the Mississippi River, which is, it's charted to look like at the bottom of the delta, there's the main, their main entrepot of the river at New Orleans. And then there's these small tributaries that also go into the Gulf of Mexico. And so when the British concede the use of the western half of Louisiana territory at the end of the 7 Years' War to the French, they think that they don't need to bother with New Orleans because they have these great tributaries. But what they don't realize is that the local map makers changed the unit of measurement. And so when the British try to get frigates up the Mississippi River, they can't, because it's basically like trying to take a frigate up the Grand River in New Brunswick.
Murray, I recall a quote ascribed to Gesner saying that Indigenous people had an almost supernatural sense of direction and knowledge of distance. I'm wondering if anyone bothered to go behind that to, investigate how they might have come to that kind of knowledge level.
I don't know if anyone's looked into that phenomena in this region, but there is work that looks at how Indigenous peoples understand concepts of space and distance in and around the Arctic. There's an article, I'm not going to remember the name of the author or the title right off the top of my head, but who looks at British map makers in the 19th century before the Franklin expedition, who were trying to figure out how to get in and around the Victoria Islands in the north, and they would ask Innu about how to do it. But the Innu explained distance by time traveled, and they incorporated that time to accommodate the fact that they're traveling with families, with the elderly, with the young and the sick. And so when they would try to give this information to British map makers in the north, it did not translate well because they were asking for units in meters and kilometers and so forth, and they were getting not what they were expecting.
Okay, that's interesting. Elizabeth Mankey just commented in chat that if everyone didn't see it, that the DEBAR survey that we were talking about here was also focused on naval issues and less on rivers. I might explain some things. And then, of course, that played them wrong in the American Revolution. Had they focused more on the rivers, things might be very different today. There's Austin Gillespie with another question. When did the first scientific expeditions and surveying of the central New Brunswick occur? And primarily, he is referring to the area around the southwest Miramichi. His first question. So when did the first scientific expeditions and surveying of the central New Brunswick area occur around southwest Miramichi? And also, do you know when early road projects first took place through central New Brunswick? So Austin has two questions.
Off the top of my head, I don't know the first expedition. I would assume it was probably, if it wasn't Champlain, it was probably Cartier. Stephanie probably, I can almost guarantee, knows the answer to that question. The second part, I would say probably not till after 1830. The first instances of the use of asphalt for the purpose of making roads starts appearing in and about that time, but they weren't super common. Like, you didn't see a highway between Fredericton or St. John until almost after Confederation, really.
Nicola Denis is the answer to the first question. The second question, you can find the answer to that in the database, in the British North America Legislative Database. So Austin, I will email that to you. So I know I have your email. I will email that to you tomorrow, and I will give you some tips on how to find the answers to the road question, because the road legislation is very easy to find. That's the one thing that for New Brunswick is all over the place. So that'll be easy to track down.
Well, I actually have something to add to that too. I'm doing some research on an 1836 road that's being made up in the north, and so I know that they were certainly talking about the Queen's Highway in 1836. So someone was doing some surveying and road building. It wouldn't have been, terrible roads compared to today, but anyway, I will say that we've concluded the question and answer section of this presentation, and I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight, and especially to Richard Yeomans for making the 4th presentation in our virtual speaker series. And it was a very successful presentation, Richard. Very interesting, with lots of questions. And I'd like to remind everybody that Thursday, February 18th at 7 p.m., Peter Little, author and historian, will be speaking live via Zoom on the extraordinary life of New Brunswick's first Black lawyer, Abraham Beverly Walker. So that's Thursday, February 18th. And I hope to see you again next month. And if you have any questions, you can always contact us at the Fredericton Region Museum by email at frederictonregionmuseum@gmail.com, by phone at 506-455-6041, or you can check out our website, frederictonregionmuseum.com, or our Facebook page for up-to-date information. And thank you everyone for attending tonight, and see you next month.